most welcome to 1222 of the Heidegger series. I will today read an article by Tarr about habit and conscious control. Ethnography and embodiment in the Alexander technique. Abstract. This article examines the process of learning the Alexander technique, a method of body re-education in relation to Bourdieu's observation that bodily knowledge is often subconscious and not easily translatable to words. It argues that Alexander technique is a useful case study for examining how the body learns because of the technique's emphasis on conscious awareness and overcoming habitual reactions. Based on 18 months of fieldwork undertaking lessons in Alexander technique and interviewing teachers and pupils, the technique is examined as a somatic mode of attention, and its effect on the habitus and bodily hexes are discussed. The relationship between habit and conscious control in the technique has implications for our understanding of embodiment in the context of teaching and learning bodily practices. The problems raised by the teaching of bodily practices seem to me to compromise a number of theoretical questions of utmost importance, insofar as the social sciences endeavor to construct theories of actions that are for the most part generated at a subconscious level and are learned by means of a silent, practical communication from body to body, as one might say. The quote from Bourdieu here: "There is a particular mode of understanding, often forgotten in theories of intelligence, which consists of understanding with one's body. There are a great many things that we understand only with our bodies at the subconscious level without having the words to say them." This is from Bourdieu. This article takes up the project of documenting the process of learning bodily practice through ethnographic writing, focusing on the insights such a practice can provide about how it is possible to understand with one's body in the way Bourdieu characterizes it above. It is based on my fieldwork in Alexander technique, a method of bodily re-education which teaches individuals to sit, stand and move more efficiently, causing less strain on muscles and joints. The focus of my research was on how the technique and the discourses put forward by its founder come to be embodied by its practitioners and pupils. In what follows, I explore the practices of Alexander technique through the work of Bourdieu, elaborated by Thomas Chorda's theory of somatic modes of attention. My intention is to demonstrate that the technique is a particularly good subject for an analysis of bodily practices, because it is not only the body, but knowledge about the body, which is its focus. It therefore provides tools itself for reflecting on bodily learning. My own introduction to the technique came through university dance training, where it was noted as a method for improving alignment and thereby bettering contemporary dance technique. It was not taught specifically on this dance course, although other methods of body re-education such as pilates and body mind centering were. When I left dance to take up sociology, I retained a fascination with these methods of somatic awareness and the knowledges that they put forward about bodies and movement. The current article derives from a larger research project which examined a number of body re-education techniques through the writings of the founders and interviews with the practitioners and pupils, in addition to hands-on learning of these techniques. This article will focus specifically on my fieldwork within the Alexander technique, as this was the method in which I was most fully immersed. Alexander technique is taught in one-to-one lessons with the teacher. The lessons are generally undertaken on a weekly basis for somewhere between 10 to 30 sessions, depending on the needs and wishes of the pupil. The technique is based on the work of Frederick Matthias Alexander, an actor and elocutionist from Tasmania, who developed a system of bodily re-education. According to Alexander's account in his 1932 book, The Use of the Self, he began to lose his voice during recitations, and the rest period prescribed by his doctor was ineffective. As a result, he began to look at his own patterns of bodily use. Studying them in the mirror, he discovered that he was cutting off his voice by pulling his neck back as he spoke. And from this discovery, he began to develop a technique of bodily realignment and constructive conscious control over behavior. He moved to London in 1904 and taught his technique there and in New York until his death in 1955. And set up a training school in London to teach other practitioners. Today, Alexander technique is often taught in acting schools and sometimes becomes part of contemporary dance training. It is also used by musicians and people suffering from back and neck problems, voice problems, or over repetitive strain injuries. From an ethnographic perspective, Alexander technique is interesting because of its status as a bodily practice whose tenets are not easily translatable into words. While words may be used in Alexander lessons, what they point to is corporal. The technique is a kind of embodied knowledge. It is only recently that ethnographers have come to attend their corporeality in ethnographic writing. In dance ethnography, the problem of representing the body and movement has been more pressing. One solution to this problem has been the adoption of movement notation system, such as that of Rudolf von Labans. Yet this requires specialized knowledge on the part of both the ethnographer who notates and the reader who must decode the notation. Further, as Farnell suggests, there are issues about the adequacy of such representations in terms of capturing the sense of the movement. Sklar has also argued that dance ethnographists must attend not only to movement, but also to its meaning for those involved in it, for which movement notation systems are clearly know-how. Chordas, 1994, has noted that anthropological studies of religious healing have tended to employ a black box model where healing is assumed to work, but no account is made of how it works, because the experiences of the subject being healed are not taken into consideration. He turns to what he calls cultural phenomenology, utilizing the phenomenological tools of Merleau-Ponty within the cultural sociological framework of Bourdieu. In order to do this, this allows him to account for the cultural conditions which produce particular kinds of bodily learning or knowledge, while attending to the lived bodily experiences which constitute charismatic healing as intriguing processes in their own right. In what follows, I will adapt Chorda's 2002 notion of somatic modes of attention to several key concepts in the Alexander technique, including doing and non-doing, and gaining and means whereby, and good use of the self. Chodash defines somatic modes of attention as culturally elaborated ways of attending to and with one's body in surroundings that include the embodied presence of others. And includes practices such as athletics, dieting, as well as other bodily techniques which require ongoing attention not only to one's own body but also to the positioning and movement of others' bodies. In the second part of the article, I will go on to discuss Bourdieu's theory of habitus and its application in order to show how studying the Alexander technique ethnographically can shed light on the processes of understanding with the body identified in the quote above. I will begin, however, with a description of what is involved in the lesson in the Alexander technique, to give the reader a sense of setting of my fieldwork and the practices involved. Setting. There is nothing to distinguish the London Alexander Centre, where I undertook my fieldwork, from the outside. Its tenancy in an old Victorian building is marked only by the words Alexander Technique on the buzzer in front of a heavy wooden doors. Inside, a narrow hallway connects the rooms it occupies on the ground floor with no main reception area. There are several teaching rooms, all of which contain one or two chairs, usually wooden, and a long paddle table at waist height, designed for lying down upon. These rooms also tend to hold books and all issues of magazines, and one has a saddle for horseback riding, a common application of the technique. The rooms are large enough to walk around in, and lessons sometimes require this. A variety of images are hung on the walls of the teaching rooms. In some of them are artistic prints or photographs, while one has photos of F.M. Alexander and a list of some of the main points he emphasized in his teaching around habit and sensory awareness. On another wall is a print of animals in motion, showing various mammals walking and running. Its presence implies that animals are models of a desirable, probably natural body. What is not on the walls is perhaps just as interesting. There are no anatomical images or models in the main treatment rooms. And Alexander Techniques makes little use of specific anatomical knowledge. In its teaching, This probably reflects Alexander's own lack of anatomical background, but also differentiates the technique from other forms of bodily re-education, such as wolfing or body-mind centering, in which anatomical images play a role. The lack of such images among Alexander teachers was confirmed in the majority of teaching venues. I visited it as part of my interviews. The Alexander Center has several directors and a number of teachers maintain an association with it, giving them opportunity to book the teaching rooms for lessons when they wish. However, the center does not specifically employ staff, and many of the teachers also work elsewhere. For the vast majority of Alexander teachers, teaching is a freelance work. There is a recognizable pattern to Alexander lessons, apparently not only in my own experience of the technique, but also in accounts given by the teachers and pupils I interviewed. Lessons tend to start with work on a chair or in front of a mirror and finish with 15 or 20 minutes of table work, where in contrast to other parts of the lesson, pupils are mainly passive and simply allow themselves to be worked upon and adjusted by the teacher. Often, pupils are encouraged to compare themselves in the mirror before and after the lesson, noting any changes that have taken place. The visual element is thus significant, and changes are not simply internal, but are expected to be observable. My first Alexander session was an introductory workshop lasting 2 hours. The teacher, a man who appeared to be in his mid-30s, began with the story of how the technique started, similar to the one described in Alexander's book, The Use of the Self. Recounted above, the story of Alexander's founding of the technique is one that most of the pupils I interviewed were familiar with, indicating its widespread use by teachers of the technique. Following this explanation, the workshop consisted of a series of activities and games used to demonstrate how our bodily perceptions affected our ways of using our bodies and teach us to inhibit our initial reactions to stimuli. The first such activity involved throwing a ball from person to person. First, the ball was simply tossed, and then an extra stage was added where we pointed to the person who was to catch the ball to give them the opportunity to prepare. In the last stage, we were instructed to tell the person to stop on some occasions as we were throwing, so that they would let it fall to the ground rather than catch it. In doing this, We were told we were playing with Alexander's principle of inhibiting habitual reactions to make ourselves consciously aware of the process of catching. The next stage of the workshop involved a demonstration of the mind-body relationship in Alexander technique. I sat across from the other pupil and she held one hand out in front of her and was asked to concentrate on allowing it to move only to the right. I was asked to try to move her arm in each direction, demonstrating how much easier it was to move her arm to the right than to the left, although all she had done was to shift her focus. Then our Alexander teacher demonstrated the same process using sight. If the pupil focused her eyes in one direction, her head turned much more easily in that direction. This also occurred even if she was only thinking of focusing in that direction. And the teacher could guess which direction she had chosen, even if he was not told. The process was then reversed, and I was given the opportunity to try this focusing activity with similar results. This activity demonstrated the ways in which our bodies responded to the direction of our minds. Following this, we were asked to each stand in front of a mirror while the teacher adjusted our head-neck-back relationship, a term which was used frequently. It refers to Alexander's idea that there is a particular alignment of the head, neck and back that is ideal. And that if this is interfered with, it will cause problems such as the loss of the voice he himself had experienced. This is also called the primary control, and there is a belief that if this is in order, the rest of the body self will fall into place. A good head-neck-back relationship involves a long neck, with a head which is directed to go forward and up, as if reaching over something held under the chin. The directions allow the head to go forward and up were repeated many times in Alexander lessons. Directions to drop the chest, knees and hips often accompanied it. In attempting to reproduce these directions with the guidance of the Alexander teacher, I found my spine getting very straight and my neck felt as if it were lengthening. Once in this position, we were asked to shift our weight from foot to foot slowly to get a feeling of all our weight being on one side of the body. Our teachers explained that this would give us a fuller sense of the weight of our bodies, which was often not felt when the muscles were tense. The remainder of the lesson was then spent doing work with chairs and the table. Initially, the other pupil was asked to observe me as I sat down and stood up, from a wooden chair several times in succession. I observed that I used my hands to push off from the chair, and she noticed that my head went unnecessarily far forward as I went to stand. The teacher then led me through the process slowly, focusing again on the head, neck, back relationship, and on allowing my knees to go forward slowly as the focal point of the movement. This felt quite different and much more difficult. The other student then went through the same process. As mentioned above, table work, sometimes known as the table turn, is a common way for Alexander's lessons to end. Lying on a table gives the pupil the opportunity to experience the changed vertical alignment without working against gravity. It is also relaxing because there is little for the pupil to do. Most of the work is done by the Alexander teacher, who adjusts the body. As one teacher noted in an interview, quote, "I think the table work has been developed hugely since Alexander's time. People enjoy that, both teachers and students. I can see it in their eyes, and they come in and I'll start working them, and I will see their eyes just looking at that table." In the introductory session, our heights were measured against the wall before and after table work. Each of us stood about a centimeter taller at the end of the session. We lay on flat surfaces with books of varying heights. Beneath our heads. As the teacher gradually guided and manipulated us with his hands until we were well aligned. Alexander teachers do not believe it is possible for the spine to be perfectly straight, because the neck is always slightly forward of the rest of the body. Although it is usually desirable that this protrusion be lessened. In table work, the neck is therefore supported with books at the base of the skull. The height of the books is important. Too many or too few, and the neck will contract, throwing the head-neck-back relationship out of alignment. We lay in semi-supine position on our backs with our knees bent. Throughout the workshop prior to this exercise, I had noticed tension between my shoulder blades when letting my neck go forward and up. This was alleviated somewhat if I tried to bring my sternum backward, but still noticeable until I lay down on the floor. In this position, our elbows were moved a distance away from our bodies. and our whole backs were arranged so that they would touch the floor. Lying with the knees bent removes the curve of the lower back, making a flat spine posture easier. The teacher manipulated our legs and hip joints, first stretching out one leg at a time, pulling on it, and then bending it back at the joint. Then placing it back in its original knees bent position, and reaching under our backs to lift our hips from the back of the pelvis and pull them up and out, flattening them toward the floor. To stand up, I was directed to come forward with the top of my head until I reached a sitting position and then rise from there. While Alexander lessons do not always contain all of these elements, many of them played a recurring role, as I shall discuss below. Also, many of the themes raised in this workshop, such as the role of perception in the body-mind relationship and the principle of inhibiting habitual responses. Are significant currents in the Alexander technique. Alexander believed that people had what he termed faulty sensory awareness, and that because of this they would be unaware that their use of themselves was wrong. The body self would not naturally sense this, and when people came upon good use for the first time, it would feel wrong precisely because it's differed from what it had come before. While some notion of a natural body is desirable and achievable through re-education, is apparent throughout Alexander's work. There is no body/self which naturally senses when it encounters good or bad use. It is only through the process of re-education that the body can come to know what good use of the self is like. Very important. However, the tension between the idea of a natural body and the obviously culture process involved in the technique is one which is not resolved in Alexander's own work or that of most of his contemporary interpreters. And indeed it appears that the technical practice of doing Alexander technique calls its theory of the natural body into question. So nota bene, there is no natural use as an animal. You cannot become natural by imitating the naturalness of an animal. This new naturalness is some way constructed. This is why it's called constructive conscious control. It is thought out, it's rational. It is not what would pertain to the natural body of Rousseau or the natural wildlife, or something that David Attenborough said, the graciousness of the antelope. The shift from faulty sensory awareness to perception occurs through what Alexander terms inhibition. While inhibition has come to have negative implications associated with the person unable to let go, in Alexander's work it has no such connotation. Inhibition is the middle step between reacting habitually and making choices about one's actions. In between these steps, one inhibits one's habitual responses, stops and consciously reconsiders one's decisions. Even immediate reactions to correct oneself must be inhibited, as these are habitual rather than conscious. Disturbances of the head-neck-back relationship in particular are considered to take one away from one's self. In Alexander's work, the term self is used to encompass anything to do with the person, via body or mind, because he sees there as inextricably linked. Throughout his writings, he avoids the use of terms such as posture, body mechanics, mental states, or subconscious, because these imply a dualistic separation of body and mind, which he seeks to avoid. Self is the substance which is worked on in Alexander technique, but the parts of the embodied self which are most relevant seem to be the head, neck and back. It is as if in Alexander technique the self resides primarily in these body parts and the consciously controlled relationship between them. Accordingly, throughout the article, the term self or body/self is used to refer to the embodied consciousness of the self implied in Alexander's terminology. Alexander's concept of inhibition is conscious, but it is not simply an inhibition applied by a disembodied mental consciousness onto a pre-reflected body. The body self is involved in this conscious control, if only in one primary relationship. It is possible then to speak of the development of a body consciousness. Does the act of inhibition acquire, with practice, the status of a consciousness of the body? Merleau-Ponty's phenomenological approach is relevant to Alexander technique in that he too understands habit as bodily, as a motor grasping of a motor significance. However, for Merleau-Ponty, habit is morally neutral, serving as a demonstration that knowledge can be bodily and not simply conscious. Whereas for Alexander, habits is negative and the aim is always to overcome habitual reactions through conscious control. In the next section, I will examine the relationship between habit and conscious control further through an analysis of Alexander technique as a somatic mode of attention. Somatic modes of attention. Alexander technique's concept of inhibition is by definition a conscious and reflected process. However, the technique claims to be holistic, involving both mind and body. This is obviously true at one level, inasmuch as it cultivates mental, conscious awareness of the body and its actions. But this still presupposes a dualistic split between mind and body, where one controls the other. Whether the body can be said to be part of this conscious awareness, however, is still at issue. In this section, through an examination of Alexander technique as a somatic mode of attention, I will analyze the ways in which consciousness and the mind-body relationship are invoked in the technique. Somatic modes of attention are culturally constituted rather than biologically given. Examples include athletic rehearsals in the mind, health consciousness, and attention to diet and dancing. Chorda suggests that understanding and identifying such modes of attention gives new insights into intersubjectivity and embodiment. Clearly, Alexander technique lessons fit this definition, being a method of attending both to and with bodies in an environment which includes the embodied presence of at least one teacher. There are several key concepts in the technique which form its modes of attention to the body. These include doing, non-doing, means whereby, as opposed to end gaining, and its development of what it terms good use of the self. Doing and not doing. As my discussion of inhibition has shown, Alexander technique is as much about not doing particular things as it is about doing them. Thus, the process of learning the technique involves learning not to do what is habitual, but also not to do at all, to inhibit any reaction. Doing the Alexander technique is thus just as much a process of learning not to do. For example, in one lesson, my teacher worked on my shoulders with the stated intention of helping me to differentiate them. Because some of the very tense muscles were not necessary for supporting the head. As he moved my shoulders with his hands, sometimes rubbing them, sometimes gently adjusting one bit or another, he told me that Your job at the moment is not to direct. That's very different from than doing nothing. You have to understand what you've done to yourself by reacting in this way. He suggested that this might sound judgmental, but that it was important as well for pupils of the technique to understand that it was not simply about developing straight but static posture, but about movement and awareness. I was not to direct myself in any particular way, but not to direct, becoming aware of and inhibiting any reaction. I had to stiffen my shoulders and change that position. On other occasions, I was encouraged to develop a principle of disinterest in what was going around me. Whether it be the adjustments of my teacher was making to me during table work, or the stimulus provided by the back of a chair which I was to put my hands on without grabbing, by directing my arms and shoulders. However, this lack of interest is not a lack of attention. It is a deliberate and cultivated disinterest aimed to keep reaction and habit from interfering with the self and misaligning the head-neck-back relationship. I think this clearly shows that we are embodying the way we interact with others, and our tension is part of reality. How we react to all others around us, that interaction, or how we decide on an attitude there, the moral, attentional attitude, or the posture, that is the whole sum of all interactions in society. It is a global thing. And all what you feel, understand, sense is an aspect of that wholeness. All people together form this wholeness. It's a globalism, and I think this is very similar to the Wittgensteinian concept of private language. We cannot have emotions by ourselves. We cannot decide how we want to feel, whether we are to be happy, unhappy, or somewhere in between, depressed or angry, or at a disadvantage in life. Everything is the side of the globality of all people, thus man, if you want. And it seems impossible at this point. How could I perceive all other people? But you constantly do that. If you want to change, as she suggested, you need to change how you react to all others. You need to define yourself in contrast to others, to have a self. And it's not like you define yourself superficially by doing it against others, because you're already a part of others. And the more you're part of others, the more individual you become. The idea of isolation to become more individual makes you both sick and unindividuated. It makes you too short of a victim of das Man. All your thinking becomes conventional, lacking in stamina, lacking in energy. You need to go out to the people. This is one of the reasons why I do this lecture among people. This is where we have the embodied knowledge. Without that, we don't have any embodiment, and therefore no active understanding knowledge. Without others, we are led into an abyss of subjectivity and convention. No isolated person can be an individual, can be his own self. This is very similar to learning in the universe. All relationships decides what the monad is, as Leibniz will have it, or Julian Barber. All situations in every part of the universe is decided on every happening in the universe. The insights in parallel, and I think they are not so different. And I am quite certain that everybody in society are included in the understanding who you are and how aware you are. In different societies, there's different levels of awareness, directionality. And I think this pretty well runs it up. I say thank you very much for your patience and have a very pleasant afternoon. Bye bye for now.